in the summer of 2016, I gave one of 4 keynote addresses at the ISCHE conference in Chicago at Loyola University. And the theme of the entire conference was the history of the body. And so my keynote address that happened at the opening ceremonies tried to set some interesting rules of engagement around what we mean when we talk about the history of the body in the history of education. So, I mean, that's sort of one of the key questions that the conference tried to address, as well as my keynote. I tried to sort of set some parameters around that relationship. It's a huge one. Of course, the history of the body has a really long scholarly pedigree in the social sciences, in the arts, and the humanities. And historians of education, of course, have contributed to that. There's been many studies in many national contexts about the role of schooling in shaping citizenship, in shaping gender relationships, in shaping power more generally. And we know that the body is intimately implicated in all of that history. So historians of education have talked about the body in their work over the long sort of, last 25, 30, 40 years. But I think that there's a sense in which work can continue to be done with the body and with the processes of embodiment that we all go through from the time we're born to the time we die. And so I think there's a hunger, or it seemed to me that there was a hunger and is a hunger on the part of historians to continue to explore some of these really key questions and key issues around what does it mean to be a body going to school? Why do we talk about the body self-consciously the way we do? So those were some of the major themes that the conference explored. In my keynote, I tried to sort of pay homage to what has been done in the field. None of us wanted to come at this conference or at these keynotes saying, "Oh, we've never talked about this before." Of course, historians have talked about, and historians of education have talked about the body, physicality, embodiment for a while. But I think one of the tasks that we took up as keynote speakers was to point a future paths for historians. So, as I said, I tried to begin the talk by just mapping out some of the major themes that have been done, major studies that have been carried out in the area. And then my goal was really to light some fires, in a sense, was to encourage my colleagues who are at the conference to really sort of go forth and do things that are that we know, based on the work that's been done, that actually still needs to be done. So that's sort of where the if you will, the taking off point in my talk was to actually inspire people to do some interesting things. So the response to the talk was, I think, really positive. People seemed to be intrigued by some of my, I guess, more provocative sort of invitations, if you will. In fact, I call the 3 main points that I talk about, I call them inspiring provocations. So I was, in fact, trying to, provocate around some of the things that we might do as historians to continue the conversation about embodiment and bodies in education. The first one, the first provocation I talked about, was for us to ask new questions about the past with the body in mind. So we've asked questions, historians of education have asked questions like, how were schools, highly disciplinary and disciplining spaces? And of course that was inspired by thinkers like Michel Foucault. Other questions such as, how were gender relationships built through and on the body in curriculum, like phys ed or home economics? How did those curricular subjects actually teach people their bodies, in a sense? So there's been, work done on that. So those are the kind of questions that we have asked. And the questions that I sort of hoped that my colleagues would go off and ask in addition had to do with, looking forward rather than looking back. So, distinguished historian of education Richard Aldridge recently has published, just before he passed away, published some wonderful work, sort of encouraging historians of education to pay attention to new scientific understandings of the brain. So Aldridge suggests that while historians have done a lot of work on sort of history of science and history of technology, historians of education have a real contribution to make by getting into the conversation on what do we know about the brain, where did our understanding of the brain come from, and what are the kind of questions that we need to be keeping in mind, pun intended, when we think about what the brain is. So, historians like Aldridge, two other contemporary thinkers, Nicholas Rose and Charlotte Epstein, have both encouraged scholars writ large, but I think historians of education have a particular role to play here in thinking about the body and new neurotechnologies, new biometrics, breakthroughs that are actually allowing scientists to claim that they can read the mind, they can actually read your thoughts, new technologies that allow both on an individual level and on a population-wide level to surveil populations. They can know your date of birth, they can know your buying habits. You stick your finger in a scanner and a door is opened or a door is closed. So, historians of education can think about what those particular future, or the future is now, kind of technologies, how is that a history of education problem? What can historians of education bring to the table around maybe some caveats around some of those technologies, or some ethical, philosophical questions around some of those technologies? So those are examples of some of the new questions that I've asked colleagues to keep in mind. A second area that I sort of was hoping to be provocative was in the whole notion of theorizing in the field. Historians use theory like other scholars, and we tend to, I think, sometimes shy away from inventing theory or conceptualizing problems in a different way or on a theoretical level that might help us sort of dig into new areas. So, there's theoretical thinking around schooling and the body as being disciplined, and I've spoken about that through Michel Foucault. But we don't often think about, how relationships amongst different bodies in schools might be part of a new theoretical approach that we can take, so that it's not always a disciplinary and a disciplining kind of setting, schools, for example, but that really kind of interesting relationships are built in schools, and that, bodies that move through hallways and move through classrooms and gymnasiums are not just being sort of told what to do without any agency. They respond. And so, people like Tara Woodyard, who's a wonderful scholar, has suggested that we think of bodies not as just, things that are acted upon, but that also act, and that are, she encouraged us to think of them as assemblages that have both relationships to other human beings, relationships to space, relationships to technology. And so, historians of education can build on that kind of thinking about seeing the body in a different way, and then going back in time and thinking about how can this new conceptualization of the body, how can it help me see the past through a whole new lens and bring understanding to the past? So that was sort of the second provocation that I offered. The third one is in some ways the most difficult one. Historians are really set in their ways, not in a bad way, but they're pretty set in their ways when it comes to methods and methodologies. So what is the historical method? Well, we know that it begins with typically going to the archive and looking at old documents or looking at old pictures, or perhaps interviewing people who lived through something. So those are very tried and true methods that we hold deeply to our hearts. But I think it's really stimulating and interesting to think about how a focus on the body might encourage historians to develop new methods of creating data, of creating understanding, or creating the raw materials that we can then sift through and bring some understanding to. So one of the, I think, an interesting method, and it's controversial because historians don't like to necessarily import themselves into their work, but thinking about how our historians' own sensory memories of going to school. So did you receive the strap? Do you remember being elated at school? Do you remember being absolutely harassed and harangued at school? How can that embodied information that historians themselves bring to their work be used as a sort of method to dig up new information? We tend to not think of ourselves as part of our studies, but we're implicated in our studies whether we want to admit it or not. So my point with that last provocation was just to really encourage people to think about your own embodied experiences. And that often triggers, oh yeah, that's really interesting. I should go and look at why it was that this happened. Or did this only happen to me in my school at this time? Or was I typical? Was I atypical? So I think that can inspire some really interesting, reflective kind of histories. So those are the three provocations that I put forth in my talk to my colleagues. And, ultimately I really wanted them, I think, to come away with asking themselves what questions in the history of education do we really want to answer, and how can the body help us to answer them? I think that, historians particularly I think historians who are placed in professional faculties, for example. So the fact that the Faculty of Education at UBC has historians who work in the faculty. So we are really, shaped by, marinated in, not only sort of these, hopes for what education might look like in the future, but also like where are we right now and what are the challenges and problems that we're facing that we can't seem to crack, or that we really need to crack, right? What are these issues, what are these problems? So, the idea that historians exist sort of over here, sort of, same old telling us what happened back behind there, that's a myth. Like that's not what we do. We actually, our goal, I think, my goal is to bring my training in history as a historian to reflect on current challenges, to think about, okay, if this is likely not new, it often isn't new. It might look new and have new aspects of it, but the problem is usually like long-standing, or the challenge, long-standing deep roots that tell us something. The roots tell us about how we might go forward. So if we're just always starting at the surface and never thinking about the roots, then we kind of move around the surface. And the roots of the issue or the problem never get addressed. So, I think in some ways that motivates historians who work in professional faculties in particular. It motivates us to think be nimble in terms of how can we contribute to this really important conversation that's going on. We know we've got a lot to contribute to the conversation, but we need to make it clearer to our colleagues how history really informs. History is always about the present. It's never about the past. It's always about the present. So how can we make that clear to our colleagues and really come up with some thinking and motivating understanding that adds to the conversation? It's not always just the background to the conversation, but it's actually really informs it, like right in the center.